The elegant ballroom of Morgan Heights Equestrian Club buzzed with perfumed conversations and tinkling champagne glasses. Wealthy collectors in tailored riding jackets moved from table to table, examining glossy photographs of prized bloodstock. This wasn't just any auction. It was invitation only, reserved for those whose bank accounts matched their ambitions in the equestrian world. Light glinted off diamond-studded belt buckles and designer boots that had never seen mud. Yet in the corner furthest from the refreshments stood a single stall that no one approached. Inside stood a bay mare, her coat dull and patchy, ribs visible through her hide, her head hanging low as if the weight of existing was too much to bear. The auction catalog listed her simply as Lot 37. No name, no lineage, no achievements, just a mare of undetermined age, suitable for companion purposes. The wealthy patrons glanced her way, then quickly averted their eyes, as if her misfortune might somehow be contagious. Whispers floated through the air like poison. "What's that thing even doing here?" someone murmured. "It's bringing down the tone of the entire event." A woman in riding jodhpurs walked past, wrinkling her nose in disgust, as if the mare's presence personally offended her. The auctioneer, a man with silver hair and practiced charm, moved through the room, working the crowd, generating excitement for the approaching bidding war on a yearling with triple champion bloodlines. Occasionally, his gaze would flicker toward the forgotten mare in the corner, and something like discomfort would cross his face before he'd turn away, focusing on easier prospects. The mare stood motionless, almost statue-like, except for the occasional ripple of skin when flies landed on her bony back. Her eyes, once perhaps bright with spirit, were now filmed over with resignation. She didn't whinny or paw the ground like the other horses, showcased in videos playing on mounted screens throughout the venue. She simply existed, a shadow in a room designed for spotlight seekers. A velvet rope separated the auction attendees from the mare, yet no one even approached it. No one bothered to read the sparse information card. No one saw how her ears still twitched at each new sound, despite her apparent detachment. It was as if an unspoken agreement had formed among the auction guests that the mare in Lot 37 wasn't worth acknowledging. At most, she received dismissive glances, a raised eyebrow, a shake of the head. The mare had been brought in through the service entrance hours before the guests arrived, quietly installed in her temporary stall, while the champagne was still being chilled. No one had seen her arrive, and most hoped they wouldn't have to see her leave. The failure she represented didn't belong in this temple of equestrian success and achievement. In a room where bloodlines were currency and potential was calculated in future winnings, she was bankruptcy personified. Yet as the evening progressed and the crowd flowed around her stall like water around an inconvenient stone, something curious happened. The mare's eyes began to follow one particular figure moving through the crowd, a man who, unlike the others, glanced her way not with disgust, but with something else entirely, something that hadn't been directed toward her in longer than she could remember: curiosity. Thomas Reed adjusted his second-hand sports coat, feeling profoundly out of place among the equestrian elite. The invitation had come as a professional courtesy, after treating the prized stallion of a wealthy client, though Thomas suspected they'd never expected him to actually attend. His weathered pickup truck had looked absurdly out of place in the parking lot filled with luxury vehicles and horse trailers worth more than his entire veterinary practice. The middle-aged veterinarian hadn't wanted to come. 20 years of treating horses had taught him that events like this weren't meant for men who still had dirt under their fingernails from morning rounds. But something had pulled him here tonight, some inexplicable feeling that he'd dismissed as professional curiosity. Now, standing in the corner with a glass of water while others sipped champagne, he realized what had truly drawn him: the mare in Lot 37. While the crowd gravitated toward the gleaming thoroughbreds and show-ready quarter horses, Thomas found himself drifting toward the forgotten stall in the corner. The mare's condition spoke of profound neglect. the kind that sparked a slow anger in his chest. He'd seen too many animals discarded once they stopped being profitable or convenient. Her coat, dull and patchy, couldn't hide the proud bone structure beneath. Her legs, though thin, showed no obvious deformities that would explain her current state. But it was her eyes that truly caught him. Beneath the resignation, beyond the dullness, Thomas saw something flicker when he approached, a flash of awareness, of assessment. This wasn't a broken animal. This was a horse that had learned to disappear while remaining perfectly alert. The auctioneer's voice pulled Thomas from his thoughts as Lot 37 was announced with noticeable disinterest. The starting bid was insultingly low, barely worth the paperwork. The crowd had already begun shifting toward the exit, eager for the next auction item to be brought out. No paddles rose, no interest registered on any face but his own. Thomas raised his paddle. The small wooden number felt impossibly heavy in his hand. The auctioneer blinked, clearly surprised that anyone had bid at all. A beat of silence followed, then uncomfortable murmurs rippled through the ballroom. A woman in riding breeches whispered to her companion, her eyes darting between Thomas and the mare with undisguised confusion. The auctioneer hesitated, looking around the room for another bid that would never come. The gavel fell with a crack that seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet room. Sold to number 42. Thomas Reed was now the owner of a horse he hadn't planned to buy, with no trailer to transport her and no proper stable waiting at home. Just a small paddock beside his modest house, where he occasionally kept recuperating patients. As he approached to complete the paperwork, he could feel the weight of judgmental stares. The crowd parted around him, like he carried something contagious. The transaction was completed with mechanical efficiency, neither the auctioneer nor the clerk meeting his eyes. Thomas didn't care. Something about this mare's quiet dignity had spoken to him in a language he couldn't quite name but instinctively understood. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that he had just purchased far more than a neglected companion animal, and the price he'd paid was nothing compared to what this mare was truly worth. The journey home had been a testament to Thomas's patience and the mare's fragile nerves. A borrowed horse trailer from a reluctant colleague, complete with sidelong glances and poorly concealed judgment. The loading itself had taken nearly 2 hours, each step forward followed by 3 steps back. Now in the pale light of dawn, Thomas watched the mare explore her new surroundings with the caution of prey, expecting predators at every turn. His property was modest by any standard. A small weathered house with an attached clinic, a 2-stall barn that had seen better days, and 3 acres of fenced pasture that rolled gently toward a line of oak trees. Nothing like the grandeur the mare had just left behind, but Thomas hoped that perhaps the simplicity might be a comfort after whatever she had endured. He decided to call her Whisper. The name had come to him during those tense quiet moments in the trailer, when her breathing had been the only sound between them, soft and measured, despite her fear. There was something in her silence that spoke volumes, a quiet dignity that refused to be diminished by circumstance. The first 72 hours revealed the depth of her wounds, not all of them visible on her scarred hide. Whisper refused food when Thomas was present, waiting until he left before approaching her water bucket with wary calculation. She positioned herself in corners, never turning her back to open doors. When Thomas entered her stall with fresh bedding, she pressed herself against the wall, eyes wide, breath shallow, as if trying to disappear through sheer force of will. A sudden movement, the harmless fall of a brush from a shelf, sent her into a panic that left her trembling for hours. The episode told Thomas more about her past than any bill of sale ever could. This wasn't just neglect. This was systematic mishandling, perhaps even deliberate cruelty. The realization settled in his chest like a cold weight. On the 4th night, Thomas dragged an old wooden chair into the barn and positioned it outside her stall. Rain drummed steadily on the metal roof as he opened his veterinary journal and began to write by lantern light. He didn't look directly at Whisper, didn't try to approach or touch her. He simply existed in her space, his voice a low, steady murmur as he read his notes aloud to himself, creating a gentle rhythm that competed with the rainfall. 2 hours passed this way, until Thomas's voice grew hoarse and his eyes heavy. As he gathered his things to leave, he noticed that Whisper had moved from her corner. Not dramatically, just a few feet forward, her neck slightly extended toward the stall door where he sat. When their eyes met, she didn't immediately retreat. For 3 heartbeats, she held his gaze before lowering her head. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was something. A willingness to consider that perhaps not all humans brought pain. Thomas didn't celebrate this small victory aloud, didn't make any sudden moves that might shatter the fragile moment. He simply nodded at her before leaving, a silent promise that tomorrow would bring the same patience, the same respect for her boundaries. What Thomas couldn't know was that this broken mare had once known kindness, once understood partnership. Somewhere beneath her fear lay memories of another life, one that circumstance and cruelty had buried but not erased completely. The road to uncovering those memories would be long, but that night, in the gentle rhythm of rain and a human voice asking nothing of her, Whisper had taken her first step. 3 weeks passed in a delicate dance of patience and small victories. Thomas kept his promises, approaching Whisper with the same gentle consistency each day. The mare no longer pressed against the wall when he entered her stall. She now accepted food from his hand, her lips carefully taking each offering with a restraint that spoke of good manners beneath her fear. It was progress measured in inches, not miles, but Thomas had learned long ago that healing rarely followed convenient timelines. Spring brought warmer days and the greening of the small pasture behind the barn. Thomas had been reluctant to move Whisper outside, worried that the open space might overwhelm her. Yet the mare's growing restlessness convinced him it was time. He opened the gate on a clear morning, stepping aside to give her space, expecting hesitation. What happened instead left him speechless. Whisper stepped into the sunlight with surprising confidence, her nostrils flaring as she took in the sense of fresh grass and open air. Then something transformed in her bearing. Her head lifted, her stride lengthened, and she moved across the pasture with a fluid grace that seemed impossible from an animal so recently malnourished. There was nothing random in her movement. She circled the pasture in perfect form, her transitions from trot to canter so smooth they appeared choreographed. Thomas leaned against the fence post, a furrow deepening between his brows. This wasn't the movement of a companion horse. This was the precision of an animal trained to perform at the highest levels. Even more telling was how she executed a perfect flying lead change without prompt, something that took most horses months of specialized training to master. The following days brought more revelations. When Thomas accidentally dropped a curry comb, making a sharp noise against the stall floor, Whisper startled, but then immediately lifted her left front hoof, holding it poised in the air as if expecting it to be handled. When Thomas approached and gently took her hoof, she remained perfectly balanced, her weight shifted in textbook form. At the sound of distant classical music playing from his house radio, Whisper's ears pricked forward, her body tensing not in fear, but in something that looked remarkably like anticipation. Her feet began to move in a precise rhythm that matched the distant melody, a shadow of training so deeply ingrained that it had survived whatever traumas had followed. One afternoon, Thomas was leading Whisper along the perimeter of the pasture when a mockingbird burst from a nearby bush. The sound was sharp and sudden, the kind of surprise that had sent her into panic weeks before. Instead, Whisper halted instantly, her body going perfectly still in response to Thomas's reflexive tension on the lead rope. The stop was so precise, so immediate, that Thomas knew it could only come from thousands of hours of professional training. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. Everything about Whisper's physical response to her environment suggested an animal that had once been worth tens of thousands of dollars, meticulously trained by experts. Yet she had been discarded, mistreated, and eventually forgotten in a corner stall at a silent auction. Thomas ran his hand along her neck, feeling the slowly returning muscle beneath her coat. The question that had been forming in his mind solidified into certainty. Whisper wasn't just any horse. She had a history, an identity that someone had gone to great lengths to erase, and Thomas was becoming increasingly determined to discover what that truth might be. The spring rain had transformed the pasture into a slick hazard. Thomas had watched from the clinic window as Whisper tested her newfound freedom, perhaps too eagerly. The slip had been sudden, her hind legs sliding out from under her on the wet grass, sending her crashing to her side with a heavy thud that made Thomas wince. She'd risen quickly, seeming more embarrassed than injured, but by evening a slight swelling had developed on her left hind leg. Thomas led her to the wash stall, the rubber mat providing secure footing as he gently hosed the mud from her legs. Whisper stood calmly now, her trust in him growing with each passing day. As the water sluiced away the caked mud, Thomas worked methodically, checking for heat or tenderness that might indicate a more serious injury beneath the swelling. The injury itself was minor, a small strain that would heal with rest. But as Thomas's hands moved up her leg, his fingers encountered an unusual texture just beneath her stifle. Years of neglect had left scars across Whisper's body, but these felt different, deliberate, almost geometric in their pattern. He frowned, reaching for a cloth to wipe away the remaining dirt. What emerged made his breath catch. There, partially obscured by what looked like intentional scarring, was the unmistakable shape of a brand. Not the typical Frise brand or simple owner's mark seen on most horses, but an intricate design, a stylized W with a crown above it. Most of it had been deliberately damaged, the skin raised in keloid scars that distorted the original shape, but enough remained for Thomas to recognize it as a professional mark. That night, long after Whisper had settled in her stall with a poultice on her leg, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open, a notepad filled with increasingly messy notes beside it. The brand had nagged at his memory all evening. He'd seen it before, or something very similar, in the winner's circle photographs of major races. After 3 hours of searching through equestrian databases and thoroughbred registries, the answer appeared on his screen. Westfield Stables, the gold standard in American racing. 6 Kentucky Derby winners in the past 2 decades, breeding fees that started at 6 figures, a waiting list for their yearlings that stretched years into the future, and a distinctive brand, a Crown W, that marked every horse born on their legendary bluegrass pastures. Thomas pushed back from the table, rubbing his tired eyes. It made no sense. A Westfield horse ending up neglected and auctioned off like unwanted furniture? The scandal would rock the racing world if it ever came to light. These weren't people who discarded valuable bloodstock. Their reputation and their profit margins depended on the careful stewardship of every animal bearing their name. Yet the evidence was literally branded into Whisper's flesh. What troubled Thomas more was the deliberate attempt to obscure that brand. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide this mare's prestigious origins. The question was why, and more importantly, who? As he shut down his computer, a new thought struck him with unsettling clarity. If Whisper truly was a Westfield horse, she wasn't just valuable, she was potentially worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, which meant that whoever had tried to erase her identity might go to equally extreme lengths to ensure she stayed hidden. Thomas glanced out his kitchen window toward the small barn, where Whisper now slept peacefully. The ordinary security of his rural veterinary practice suddenly seemed terribly inadequate. Westfield Stables sprawled across 500 acres of Kentucky bluegrass, its white fences and pristine barns gleaming under the morning sun. Thomas adjusted his collar, feeling uncomfortably formal in his seldom-worn suit. The pretext for his visit had been carefully constructed: a potential client seeking breeding advice for a mare with similar bloodlines to Westfield stock. A half-truth that had earned him this tour with Marcus Westfield himself, the fourth-generation owner of the racing dynasty. The main breeding barn was climate-controlled perfection, the air lightly scented with premium bedding and polished leather, a stark contrast to Thomas's humble facility. Horses worth millions gazed curiously from immaculate stalls as Marcus led him through, pointing out current champions and promising youngsters with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to impressing visitors. Thomas maintained his professional demeanor, asking appropriate questions about bloodlines and training methods, while searching for an opening to broach his true interest. The opportunity came when they passed a wall of photographs, a shrine to the stable's greatest champions. His eyes caught on a familiar shape, a bay mare with a distinctive white star that twisted like a flame down her face. The resemblance to Whisper was uncanny, though this horse stood proud and gleaming, not thin and scarred. With carefully feigned casualness, Thomas inquired about the mare in the photograph. Marcus's expression shifted subtly, a shadow crossing his features before his public smile reasserted itself. Midnight Whisper, the stable's greatest mare, 3 consecutive stakes wins, and a track record that still stood unbroken. Her breeding potential had been limitless, had been past tense. The language wasn't lost on Thomas. Following a delicate prompt, Marcus revealed that Midnight Whisper had vanished 3 years ago, a devastating loss, both emotionally and financially. Marcus's voice tightened as he explained how they discovered her stall empty one morning. No signs of forced entry, no demands for ransom. The investigation had gone cold, despite substantial rewards offered for information. Thomas noted how the stable manager, who had been trailing behind them, suddenly became intensely interested in his phone. When the subject of Midnight Whisper arose, the tension in the barn had shifted perceptibly, staff members finding reasons to drift away from the conversation. Something about this story made everyone profoundly uncomfortable. When Thomas asked if they had documentation of Midnight Whisper's distinctive markings or her registration photographs, Marcus's smile became fixed. Of course they did, but those records were confidential, available only to law enforcement and insurance investigators. His tone made it clear the subject was closed. As the tour concluded, Thomas thanked Marcus for his time, promising to be in touch about breeding options that would never materialize. At the parking area, he noticed a weathered groom watching him with unusual intensity from beside the equipment shed. The man's gaze followed Thomas all the way to his truck, calculating and cold. Driving down the long tree-lined exit from Westfield Stables, Thomas's mind raced. The photographs, the uncomfortable silences, the abrupt topic changes, all pointed to something deeply wrong beneath the polished surface of Westfield's operation. Midnight Whisper hadn't simply disappeared. She had become a subject no one wanted to discuss openly. Thomas checked his rearview mirror, an unfamiliar sense of unease settling between his shoulder blades. The groom, who had watched him so intently, was now speaking urgently into a cell phone, his eyes still fixed on Thomas's departing vehicle. Whatever secrets surrounded Midnight Whisper, Thomas was now perilously close to uncovering them. The unmarked envelope arrived 3 days after Thomas's visit to Westfield, slipped under his clinic door sometime before dawn. No return address, no note, just a single USB drive wrapped in a torn piece of paper with a hastily scrawled message, "For the mare's sake." Thomas recognized the handwriting immediately, angular and tight, matching the medication charts he'd glimpsed at Westfield. The night watchman, the older man who'd watched him so intently from the equipment shed. The drive contained a treasure trove of damning information: stable management records, veterinary reports, security footage, and emails spanning 3 years. Thomas spent a sleepless night piecing together the fragments of Midnight Whisper's stolen life, the truth more disturbing than he had imagined. The mare had suffered a minor tendon injury during training, nothing career-ending, but requiring 6 months of recovery. Westfield's head trainer had documented this faithfully. But what followed was a calculated betrayal by Westfield's assistant trainer, Gregory Holt, a man passed over for promotion one too many times. The security footage showed Holt leading Midnight Whisper from her stall at 2:17 a.m., sedated but walking, into a waiting trailer. Financial records revealed the bitter truth. Holt had sold her to a broker specializing in problem racehorses using forged paperwork that listed her as an unregistered mare with chronic lameness. The broker had sold her to a show-jumping trainer in Ohio who pushed her too hard too fast, reopening her old injury and creating new ones. When she could no longer jump, she was sold again, this time to a riding school that worked her relentlessly until her body began to fail. The last transaction showed her sale to a dealer known for supplying auction houses with budget-friendly companion horses, a euphemism for animals too damaged to serve any other purpose. Each step of her descent had been accompanied by a new name, each owner erasing more of her identity, whether through ignorance or deliberate deception. Most damning were the emails between Marcus Westfield and his insurance provider. Midnight Whisper had been insured for $1.2 million. The investigation into her disappearance had initially been thorough, but Marcus had called it off after just 3 months, collecting the full insurance payout. His correspondence suggested he had learned of Holt's betrayal, but chose silence over scandal. A public admission that Westfield's security had been breached, that their prize mare had been stolen by their own employee, would damage their reputation and breeding program far more than the quiet fiction of an unsolved theft. Thomas cross-referenced the veterinary records with Whisper's current condition. The distinctive scar on her left hock, the slight asymmetry in her shoulders, the pattern of muscle development, all matched perfectly with Midnight Whisper's documented history. The DNA testing would be a formality at this point. He already knew the truth. Dawn was breaking as Thomas finally closed his laptop. The mare in his barn wasn't just any thoroughbred. She was racing royalty, a record-breaking champion worth millions, deliberately discarded and systematically broken. Her journey from Westfield's immaculate stalls to the silent auction had been orchestrated through layers of deception, motivated first by revenge and then by greed. Thomas stared at his reflection in the darkened window, the enormity of his discovery settling over him. The question was no longer who Whisper really was, but what he would do with this explosive truth. 6 months of careful rehabilitation had transformed Whisper. Her coat now gleamed with health, muscle had filled out her once gaunt frame, and the dullness in her eyes had given way to a quiet alertness. Thomas had worked with her daily, building upon the foundation of her world-class training, while healing the psychological wounds of her lost years. The partnership between them had deepened into something extraordinary, a mutual trust that transcended the typical bond between human and horse. The decision to enter the regional pleasure class at the county fairgrounds had been impulsive, prompted more by Thomas's desire to give Whisper a change of scenery than any competitive ambition. It was a modest event, nothing like the prestigious venues where Midnight Whisper had once commanded attention. The fairgrounds were humble, weathered wooden grandstands and a simple dirt arena, but the autumn sunshine and festive atmosphere made it welcoming nonetheless. Thomas kept Whisper away from the crowds, warming her up in the quieter practice ring. Each movement revealed her true breeding, the effortless collection, the floating trot that barely seemed to touch the ground, the perfect balance that made complex maneuvers look elementary. Other riders paused their own warm-ups to watch, a few shaking their heads in disbelief that such a horse would appear at their local show. When their class was called, Thomas guided Whisper into the main arena. 20 other horses circled the perimeter, a mix of breeds and training levels. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a critical eye, watched from the center as they demonstrated the required gaits. Whisper moved with such natural elevation that she seemed to be performing an entirely different discipline than the others. Her head carriage proud, her transitions seamless. During the individual pattern work, the ripple of recognition began. A man in the second row of the grandstand stood abruptly, his program falling forgotten to the ground. James Conway, former assistant trainer at Westfield, before Marcus had brought in his nephew to replace him. Conway's eyes never left Whisper as she executed a perfect extended trot across the diagonal, her distinctive rhythm unmistakable to anyone who had worked with her during her racing days. Conway made his way to the arena rail, his expression a complex mixture of disbelief and wonder. By now, others were watching his reaction more than the horses. The judge had noticed too, her professional demeanor momentarily slipping as she stared at the bay mare whose movement pattern she had seen before, in winners' circles and racing magazines. When Thomas and Whisper were announced as the class winners, the applause was tinged with whispers. Conway was already pushing through the crowd toward the exit gate, where Thomas would leave the arena. His phone was in his hand, his fingers typing frantically as he walked. Thomas felt the shift in atmosphere as he guided Whisper back toward their trailer. The quiet local show had suddenly become something else entirely. Curious eyes followed them, and conversations hushed as they passed. Word was spreading rapidly. The mysterious disappearance of Midnight Whisper might finally have an answer. As Thomas loaded Whisper into the trailer, he caught sight of Conway standing a respectful distance away, waiting. Several other people had gathered behind him, phones raised to capture images of the mare. Thomas sighed, resting his forehead briefly against Whisper's neck. The peaceful rehabilitation, the quiet healing they had shared, it was about to end. The world that had once discarded her now wanted her back, and Thomas wasn't certain that was a gift. The story broke across equestrian media with the force of a hurricane. Midnight Whisper found alive, champion mare discovered at local show. The resurrection of racing royalty. Thomas's modest veterinary clinic became the unlikely center of a media storm, his phone ringing constantly with calls from journalists, racing officials, and curious onlookers. Whisper, oblivious to her newfound celebrity, continued her daily routine in the small paddock behind the barn, her ears flicking occasionally at the unfamiliar cars lining the country road. The most surprising visitors arrived 3 days after the show. The gleaming black SUV with Westfield's distinctive logo pulled into Thomas's gravel driveway just after noon. Marcus Westfield himself stepped out, accompanied by his attorney and the insurance adjuster who had processed the original claim. Thomas met them in the clinic's small waiting room, keeping Whisper safely out of sight in the barn. The offer was extraordinary, 7 figures, substantially more than Whisper's insurance value, with assurances of the finest care available for the remainder of her life. Marcus spoke of legacy, of bringing her home to where she belonged, of righting wrongs that he insisted had occurred without his knowledge. His voice was persuasive, his arguments reasonable, his checkbook open. What Marcus didn't mention was the mounting legal pressure from the insurance company demanding the return of their payout, or the whispers of criminal negligence in Westfield's security protocols, or the impending exposé on Gregory Holt's web of horse trafficking that led directly back to Westfield's employment practices. Midnight Whisper's return would provide Marcus with something invaluable, a redemption narrative powerful enough to overshadow the growing scandal. As the meeting concluded without Thomas's commitment, another vehicle appeared in the driveway. The woman who emerged was familiar. She had stood in designer riding clothes at the silent auction months ago, her nose wrinkled in disgust at the sight of a broken-down mare not worth her attention. Now she approached with a warm smile and business card extended, representing a syndicate of investors eager to secure Midnight Whisper for their breeding program. Her offer surpassed Westfield's by 20%. By week's end, Thomas had received 11 serious offers, each more generous than the last. The same world that had once allowed Whisper to fall through the cracks now clamored to claim her. The auction house that had barely been able to give her away now requested exclusive rights to her first foal. People who wouldn't spare her a glance in her darkest hour now sought selfies with the famous rescue case. The morning of his decision, Thomas rose before dawn and walked to the barn. Whisper nickered softly at his approach, her head extending over the stall door to greet him. Her eyes, once dull with resignation, now held a calm wisdom. The trust between them had been earned through countless hours of patience, through pain and healing, through a journey that money couldn't measure. Thomas made his choice, not based on vindication or fortune, but on one simple truth: Whisper had already found her home. The paperwork he filed that afternoon established the Midnight Whisper Foundation, transferring the majority of Westfield's settlement into a trust dedicated to rescuing other forgotten champions. The mare herself would remain where she had finally found peace, with the one person who had seen her value when she stood alone in a corner stall, deemed worthless by a world too blind to recognize true worth. If you've been moved by Whisper's journey from forgotten champion to beloved survivor, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories. Thank you for watching, and I'll hope to see you in the next video.